All right. So, Marco, thanks for joining me today. 2020 sure has been interesting so far, hasn't it?
Yes, it's every day's a new adventure.
So, let's put in context of books, and we'll keep all the other craziness out of it, um, as much as we can, I guess. But let's start with January and February. We had, uh, as some people are calling it, BC before COVID. AAP's stat shot said that sales were up about 3.5% year over year for those first 2 months. So before anything happened, I mean, I was in Midtown Manhattan on February 10th and 11th for our Book Manufacturing Master Conference. We were sold out. Publishers were there. Printers were there. There was, some talk of this whole COVID thing, but people were still generally excited. So, how do you think things were looking in the printed book space at the beginning of the year?
So I'll look at the macro trends, right? And so the big macro trend is that in the U.S. market in particular, right, Amazon continues to gain dominance. They're, I don't know, depending on who you believe, account for something like 50% of all books sold, and they've become amazingly powerful as a conduit, right, to either move things forward or slow things down, depending on what they want to promote at any given moment. And so one of the things that's happened as a result of that Amazon effect is the slow boat from China and getting books printed in China just is disconnected really from the business patterns and the orders, how people want to get books and how fast they expect to get them, right? And nobody wants to hold inventory. So all of that has worked, I think, on a long-term basis, really in favor of onshoring things back to North America. And books have been a great beneficiary of that.
Sure. So, in terms of coming out of the Christmas season, right, which is when a ton of the books are sold via Amazon or all the other channels,
Right.
going into January and February, we were still seeing the trend of people obviously still buying printed books. Nothing's gone fully digital yet. Obviously, certain markets were having different reactions. The overall, the printed book sales were up, but when you look at trade versus educational, you see some variances. Was that still kind of holding up again, BC, before everything happened?
Yeah, I think things were relatively steady, right? But there
Right.
were warning signs, right, popping up. And one of these warning signs is in the manufacturing side of things. Some of the larger book manufacturers, right, were trying to figure out where to take their businesses and whether they should perhaps sell some of those manufacturing plants and the likes. And so that caused a lot of uncertainty. And that was really, something that got magnified dramatically as we entered this whole COVID-19 crisis. But there was some infrastructure challenges already underway at that point in February, in my opinion.
So let's just address that one right from the get-go. I think no one listening to this is going to be, not knowing what we're talking about here. But you've got the failed LSC Quad merger, um, kind of threw everybody for a loop, and then you've got LSC, the bankruptcy looming at that point, and then Quad saying we're getting rid of all of our book plants. With at that time, no one had really stepped forward as a viable buyer, someone that was ready to snap it up and keep it going. Um, so with folks, publishers, certain, anybody who was their customers started to look around, I guess, for lack of a better term, in case they felt, especially on the Quad side, because if they thought those weren't going to operate. Um, but as you said, we've seen more of business coming back from China that may have been there in the past. So, how would you frame all of that in together in terms of being good, bad for other manufacturers, good, bad for publishers? I mean, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so it's in my mind, it's fairly simple, right? So first of all, you've got Quad, whose book manufacturing business, in my opinion, is probably not really sellable as an entity as a whole, right? Because it's so large, and you know, this is a terrible analogy, but it's akin to somebody who built this giant McMansion, right, with all these whiz bang features and all these options and things, and now as we're slimming down and we want less labor and less complexity, nobody wants all that complexity, right? So in the end, there's some beautiful equipment that will probably make its way into the market somewhere, but as an entity as a whole, right, it's probably, for lack of a better word, gone, right? So if I'm
Right.
a publisher and I look at that and say, oh my God, right? So here's a huge source of book manufacturing that's now effectively gone. Um, and my second biggest choice is a company that's in bankruptcy, right? And so that's got me concerned. So what I'm doing as a publisher now is I am scrambling like mad, trying to basically split up my work among enough medium and smaller size guys so that I can be assured I can get my books printed and sold when I need them, right? I'm now hedging like crazy. And it's caused some very interesting things because there's a local company up north from us called Bradford and Bigelow.
Hmm?
And, they're a wonderful family owned business. And I'm sure you've probably heard the owner, John Galligan, talk about, you can have it three ways: 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 11, 8.5 by 11. Those are your choices. And, he's made a phenomenal business model out of that. They've just added, I think, something like doubled the amount of manufacturing capacity they'll have by the end of the year. So they're investing. So the small to medium guys are actually in a fairly good position as a result, right, of two big guys effectively no longer as viable as they once were, right?
Yeah.
So that's an artificial bump if you're a medium to small manufacturer. It's, you thank your blessing and say, well, too bad for them, but it makes me very happy, right? So the net effect, however, is that it's not quite as wonderful as it seems, right? So there's a few things going on. First of all, Amazon is a really, uh, I think, unpredictable partner in all of this, right? So when COVID hit, they basically slowed down all book promotions and they slowed the delivery times of books. So some of these book manufacturers that are, fairly dependent on Amazon, all of a sudden they didn't get any orders for 2 or 3 weeks. So, whoa, what do I do with my plant now? Right. So then it becomes very difficult to manage. So that's one issue. The other side of the coin is Amazon's not the only player in town, right? There is still independent bookstores. Yes, okay, many of them obviously weren't open as storefronts, but there's other online channels, right, that are coming into play because again, both the book manufacturers and the publishers probably don't want to put all of their eggs in Amazon either, right?
Sure.
So all of that ultimately is good news long term. Now, there are a few other pieces at play here. So first of all, I would suspect, and this is a guess, right, that during this whole crisis, there's a lot more budding authors that are trying to mint themselves as up and coming authors. And so the number of titles will probably jump up fairly dramatically, right? There'll be COVID stories, there'll be family stories, and none of these things is probably going to become a bestseller in the sense that you would have, a Harry Potter, The Goblet of Fire bestseller, right? There is no $10 million bestsellers these days, but that's okay, right? Because we're getting a lot more content being put out there. Then there'll be a knock-on effect where at some point somebody says, look, a lot of this content, frankly, is not all that great, right? It's poorly written, and so then all of a sudden curation is going to become a much more viable and important part. So all of a sudden now the publishers, right, will probably come back with more important roles in terms of managing content and making sure that things are truly readable. So these are big changes. There is one more sort of negative factor going on at the moment, and that's going to hit some book manufacturers very badly, and that is the educational market. So you can just imagine, right, with tax revenues down dramatically because there have been no retail sales, right? All of a sudden the school budgets are getting whacked left and right, right? There's layoffs and teachers. And so one of the easiest things to cut is we're not reordering books this year. We're going to hang on to the books we had last year and just repurpose them. So I can tell you that some of the very largest educational book manufacturers, those orders were supposed to have been in the May and June timeframe. They're hardly seeing any orders at all. So, the overall book category might not look great when you look at the APP statistics, but it really depends on the niche that you're in, right?
Yeah, for sure. And that's a great kind of segue to talking about uh I guess the height of COVID time, right? If we talk about March, April, May, um, AAP released their March numbers and book printing was down 8.5%, but like the K through 12 market was, 20, like, I think it was like 25%. It was a big hit of that, exactly as you said. Um, and we talked to our members. We had some webinars of BMI members, just we called them industry check-ins, just seeing how everybody's doing and trying to get a gauge of the industry. And most manufacturers were saying in April and May, they were running it anywhere from 60 to 75% capacity. Things were way down, and those certain folks having in worse spots than others, especially if they had a lot of educational materials or they had other things. And they all also echoed your sentiments on the Amazon thing. When Amazon slowed things down, they were struggling because they just weren't getting orders. I remember ordering a book during everything, and it said it was going to take 3 weeks. Now the good thing is it took a week, but it wasn't 2 days, right? So um, with everything you mentioned, everything I just mentioned, and now that it's June, believe it or not, which is crazy. It's been a crazy 2 years this last 6 months, but you've got some fundamental changes happening, right? We talk about quad and LSC not being fully resolved at this point. You've got uh, the educational market really reeling. I mean, we don't know even if schools are going to come back in August as normal. Um, and, but could that also present opportunity? Do you see, especially on the educational market, okay, we're not ordering brand new science textbooks. However, we may have some more consumable type book printing happening if kids are going to have to be schooled at home or something of the like.
So again, maybe not a perfect analogy, but I think of it almost as like global climate change. This is like book climate change. And what you're going to see is instead of these relatively predictable orders that we've had in the past, you're going to see peaks and valleys come out of nowhere, right? So educational books are way down at this moment. And then as you noted, right, some school district or state, right, let's say Texas, decides that, these are the books that people are going to need at home. And you get these huge orders coming out of nowhere. How do you manage that? So the peaks and the valleys are going to become really problematic. And what's going to connect to that, and it's not just for educational books, it's also for trade books, is that the manufacturing infrastructure, right, has to become more flexible. You've got to be able to scale up and down very quickly. At the same time, if I were an owner of a book manufacturing plant, I actually don't want that much labor in my plant, right? Because it's hard to keep these guys 6 feet apart. It's, a liability, right? If one gets infected, the Board of Health probably shuts down my entire facility. The, decontamination cost is going to be thousands of dollars. So I want to really reduce the amount of labor I have dramatically. And I want to be able to have lots more flexibility, right, in volume and so forth. So I think ultimately what will this all lead to is that, number one, it's going to dramatically accelerate the growth of digital printing of books because that reduces the number of operators you need on the print side. Doesn't reduce the number of operators or finishers, right, on the back end side, but you can solve that to a large degree by also standardizing things. We've conditioned the world that you can have any book size you want, right, on any paper. I think these days are going to disappear because it's just not sustainable, right? Now, there's another huge piece that could potentially hit, um, and it may not be as impactful in the book industry as it will be in other commercial print industries, and that is the availability and cost of paper. So with overall offset volumes down, easily 40% or more, what is going to happen is the number of paper mills that are going to be left is going to shrink, and all of that's going to accelerate. So now these wonderful economies of scale that helped us so much over the last 2 decades, right, to get lower and lower cost of paper, are now going to start to work against us because we don't have the volumes anymore. So the cost of paper is going to go up dramatically. Again, that's going to cause more and more of the book manufacturers to have to tell their publishers, you want cream, stock number 105? We have cream stock number 101, and that's all we have. So it's that or the highway, right? And so you are going to see a lot more streamlining and reduction in the amount of options in order to be able to try to maintain costs as best as possible. The good news is on the trade book side, I think that there is some price elasticity there, right? So if you increase the price of a book by 50 cents because your paper cost went up, that probably isn't going to prevent somebody from buying that book.
Right.
On the educational side, yes, that's going to be a huge problem. 50 cents on every single book is going to cause a budget crisis for these guys.
Yeah,
So,
it's it, it's a lot of question marks, right? I mean, you've especially you mentioned paper. I know was it Domtar? Somebody had just closed something recently or reduced capacity recently,
yeah.
and we do keep seeing that. You've got the uncertainty around the education market, just in general. We don't know what schools are going to be doing, even in the next 3 months. So now that we've made it to June, and uncertainty is really the name of the game. We don't know if, we're starting to see some numbers creep up in certain states as they reopen. The push towards back to normal isn't quite where we had hoped at this point. And then you throw in an election coming up. Publishers have pushed certain titles to the fall that were maybe coming out in the spring. So, like you said,
The one thing I do,
adjusting to volumes is going to be critical, right? Because now printers who are used to maybe their normal October, November peak timing, getting ready for Christmas, now may have an extra few titles that were postponed. And if schools don't go back in the fall, but then start in January, maybe there's a new run. So what do we think's going to happen here moving forward the rest of 2020 and into 21?
so I would say there is no new normal
Yeah.
because as we come out of this, every day is going to have unexpected changes, right? All of a sudden, some state decides to go back. They're going to want their books in like 2-week turnaround. That's not normal, right? But you don't want to lose that business, so you're going to pull out all stops to be able to get it. So a few things are going to happen. First of all, those book manufacturers that have the ability to invest will probably start to inventory more paper because, again, the peaks and valleys of paper delivery are going to become a problem. Particularly really inexpensive paper, because a lot of that inexpensive paper, right, came out of the Far East. So there's wide availability of higher quality papers that are manufactured domestically, but really inexpensive papers, I think you're going to see some challenges with that. So the book manufacturers are going to have to allocate more of their resources to holding inventory. Then what will happen is basically they'll over inventory paper, and that will cause paper pricing from the mills to probably plummet, right? Because now they're sitting on too much capacity. So the peaks and the valleys that are going to happen are going to be constant. It's our global climate change, right? It's like, it's not like summer is warm. No, summer could be scorching hot, or it could be really cold. All of this is going to happen in our book industry. So the ability to become as flexible as possible is going to become paramount. And that's, again, going back to, our friends at Quad. one of the things that probably really hurt them because they weren't really flexible, right? They had way too many options for all of their publishers. The amount of finish equipment, I mean, some of their plants are the size of multiple football fields, right? And that becomes impossible to maintain, all that overhead, all that associated maintenance. So the reduction in the number of formats that are available, the reduction in the types of paper that's available, all of that is, I suppose, the new normal. But then the peaks and valleys are never going to settle into a new normal. By the way, that reminds me, one of the things that's probably going to become more important than ever is partnerships among the book manufacturers, right? So they can help each other out with these peaks and valleys, right? I've got capacity, I'll print your jobs now. I don't have capacity, right? Will you take it, kind of thing. So in a way, I think this will bring a lot of these smaller independent book manufacturers much closer together than ever before, because there's no choice, right?
Yeah.
If you survive, you have to have better partnerships.
Absolutely, and I think we see that at the association. I think a lot of our members, that's one of the reasons they enjoy being members of the association and take advantage of what we offer as an association, is to have those introductions and make those business partnerships that they know they're going to need down the road as things change. And we've seen certain companies have announced growths like Warzala, building, X Space and folks like that. Other people, I mean, if you talk to the OEMs, you hear that they're still selling machinery. So there are people out there that are expanding their capacity. Um, but how, as the manufacturers are changing and most of them are adding some sort of digital capacity to be able to be flexible and move around a little bit, how do you see the publishers changing at the same time? Because I sit on the manufacturing side with my members. So, we did have our book manufacturing mastered event in February where we had the publishers in with us, hearing their challenges and what they're seeing. But how do you see the publishing world adapting to be able to work in these new ebbs and flows?
I think they're probably more confused and scared than anybody else because, number one, the traditional infrastructure of how they bought books is basically disappearing, right? Their big suppliers are disappearing underneath them. They're having to scramble to basically qualify these smaller and medium-sized book manufacturers, right? Because they've got to meet certain quality standards. They've got to fit into their SAP systems, their ERP systems. I mean, you name it. So imagine the horrific sort of pressure, right, among these publishers to basically find a whole bunch of new suppliers, right, and qualify them. That's immensely painful. So that's one problem. The second problem is that they have a lot of people within those publishing organizations that were extremely experienced, right, at understanding book technology. Those skill sets are going to disappear. Um, and they're going to disappear because there's no budget, right, to have the perfect book in that off-white paper number 105 or whatever. So now all of a sudden, the book manufacturer, also have to go back into these publishers and effectively educate a whole new generation of managers within these publishers as to what's viable and what's not viable. You're no longer an order taker as a book manufacturer. You're becoming more of a partner. And you've got to teach these guys to say, well, if you want this book, right, here's what your options. You can have it in 8.5 by 11, and we can get it out the door in 2 days. You can have it in 6 by 9, but that takes extra finishing work. So now that's 4-day delivery, right? And by the way, if you take this paper versus that paper, we're going to be able to save you X number of pennies per book. So the collaborative nature that now needs to happen is going to become more important than ever. And again, remember, these publishers are scared, right? This is all foreign stuff.
It's funny because I think, like I said, we had that book manufacturing master event in February, and I think if there was one constant theme that ran throughout it, it was publishers lean on your manufacturers as partners to help you navigate the best way to do this because things are changing, and that it's not, You shouldn't be just coming at them with, yeah, I want this 13 and a quarter by 8 1/2, or 16th, 9/16 trim size, with purple paper and white ink. Is it's got to be, here are the options. Here's what you need to be looking at. Here's what you need to be thinking about moving forward, as maybe your first run's going to be offset, but your follow-ups are going to be digital and you want continuity. So now we got to look at it a completely different way.
It's a wonderful opportunity, Matt, for a book manufacturer in a way, because yes, publishers have been shrinking inventory for years, right? And we're trying to get down to zero inventory, but we don't ever really get there. But it does open an opportunity for the book manufacturer to take a look into the logistics and the supply of how these books are delivered, and take a more active role in that, right?
Yeah.
Because there's margin in there somewhere, right? That could be, split between the publisher and the book manufacturer if things move to a more sort of efficient supply chain, so end to end. So again, these book manufacturers are no longer just companies who take paper and print it and bind it and ship it kind of thing. They're now having to become far more, I guess, pervasive in that whole end to end chain of things, right?
Yeah, for
So
sure.
I think it's, of all the print industries I can think of, there's only two that I would personally want to be in if I had such a choice. One would be in the packaging industry, right? Because people are going to continue to eat,
Yeah.
and the whole benefit of moving from large institutional packaging for restaurants to really small packages has caused that packaging industry to just explode. So printing of packaging has been absolutely wonderful during this crisis. The other area I think is I want to be a small, medium-sized book manufacturer, because artificially, in part because of course, Quad and LSC, you've got a huge bump, but also now there's this great opportunity to change the business models, right? And get out and under from that lowest cost per thousand to here's what we can deliver to help you make money.
Yeah.
So it's
No, you know what? That's a fine way to end this, because I was going to say, if there's one thing that you could say to be a cheerleader for the printed book, what would it be? I think that might be it.
yeah, we know a lot of smaller and medium-sized book manufacturers, and okay, life isn't always easy, but at the end of the day, they're going to end up being in a far better position, I think, than somebody who's in, let's say, inkjet textile manufacturing of apparel, because that's truly a very discretionary thing. Yeah, books are discretionary too, but they're easier to buy because they're lower cost, right? And we're not needing clothing so much because we're not going to weddings and graduations and big events, and many of us are not going into an office. So, but books, man, it's like a little piece of inner joy. It's an escape, a very inexpensive escape for a while.
Yeah,
So.
for sure. Well, hey, Marco, I appreciate it. And hopefully we'll be able to see each other in person sooner rather than later.
Yes, I'm looking forward to it. It's very strange not having been on an airplane since February 28th.
Yeah, yeah.
Longest time ever in my last 30 years.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I can imagine, but think of all the saved baggage fees you have now.
All right. Yep. All
All
right,
right.
Matt.
Thanks,
Thanks
Marco. I
again.
appreciate it.
You're welcome. See you.
See ya.